Hello, U.S. history students. So this week we're picking up with our discussion of the Civil War. Now, where we left off last week, we left at the end of the war, 1861, 1862, and we talked about that battle at Antietam or Sharpsburg, okay, which technically is a draw, but the Union is going to count it as a victory. The North, being the Union, they're going to count it as a victory because Lee and the Confederates retreat back to Virginia. Okay. Also, last week we talked about Lincoln and his view of slavery. He is definitely an anti-slavery believer, but he does not think that the Constitution gives him the power to do anything about slavery yet. Okay, so where we're going to pick up today is we're going to talk about a document called the Emancipation Proclamation that's going to kind of tie all this stuff together. Okay, now as you follow along, there's a set of notes that goes with this. It's a PowerPoint presentation, but I think you should still be able to fill in the information. And I know that there are three questions at the beginning. What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? Lincoln hoped the Emancipation Proclamation would also encourage what? And how was the Emancipation Proclamation a political move? All right. We're going to go back and answer those at the end. All right. So, right now, we're going to pick up and quickly review Lincoln's ideas of slavery. Now, his ideas of slavery are going to evolve the longer the war goes on, the more he's in the White House. And we'll talk about what that means here as we move through. All right. Now, number one, you have to remember Lincoln disliked slavery. Okay. He is anti slavery. He doesn't like it. He definitely doesn't want it to spread into new territories and new states. We talked about that with his running in 1854 for that Senate seat from Illinois. But as president, he does not believe the government has the power to abolish slavery. Okay. The Constitution has not given him the power to abolish slavery. All right. So, as much as he doesn't like it, he doesn't think he can get rid of it completely. Okay. A couple of incidences from his youth, from his childhood. When he was a young man, he worked on a riverboat, often traveling up the Mississippi and other tributaries, and he saw slavery firsthand. He saw slave auctions and things like that, and he saw the horrors of families being ripped apart. I mean, he also saw the brutality. He saw slaves that had been whipped and punished and things like that. And he made the comment, as I would not want to be a slave, I would not want to own slaves. Okay, so he is very much anti-slavery. You have to understand that, even though he doesn't think the government gives him the power to do anything about it. Now, early on, he makes it clear that his reason for fighting the war is to preserve the Union, not in slavery. Okay. And we talked about in the Southern mindset, despite the fact he's anti slavery and he says things like, I'm going to preserve the Union, I don't want to end slavery. In fact, he makes the statement, if I could preserve the Union and free all the slaves, I would do it. But if I could preserve the Union and free none of the slaves, I would do that as well. So even though he's anti-slavery, the South equates him with abolitionism, and he's just not there yet. All right. Now that's going to change as the war goes on. All right. So in the beginning, you got to understand he's anti-slavery. He doesn't think the government gives him the power to do anything about it, and he's very much concerned about holding the country together. As the war goes on, emancipation, freeing the slaves, abolishing slavery, begins to offer a strategic benefit for the war effort. Now, besides that, Lincoln is also, thanks to guys like Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists, he is beginning to see that slavery is a moral wrong and it should be gotten rid of. Okay, so he's beginning to say, I need to do something about slavery. Nothing says we can't change the Constitution and give me the power to do something about slavery. 13th Amendment, but that comes later. Okay. So he's beginning to see, I need to do something about it. Plus, it offers a strategic benefit. Number one, the abolitionist movement is very strong in Europe, especially in countries like Britain and France. And what's interesting is the Confederacy, the South, hopes that Britain and France will come in on their side. Okay. Britain in particular. Britain depends on cotton exports from the South. So the hope is that Britain and France will come in on the Confederate side and help them in the war effort. Well, if Lincoln makes the war about abolitionism, about emancipation and freeing the slaves, that would discourage Britain from joining the Confederacy and supporting the Confederacy, and France as well. Okay, so number one, if Lincoln goes with emancipation and abolitionism, that could keep Britain and France out of the war on the side of the Confederacy. Number two, not only is it strategic, but it is also a weapon of war. Okay, like I said, Lincoln believes it's a moral issue. I'm now beginning to see I need to do something, I need to get rid of it, but it's also strategic and it's a weapon of war. Okay. Number one, all right, if we free the slaves, who are they going to fight for? The North, all right? Lincoln hoped that if he freed the slaves would come fight for the North. In fact, that's what Frederick Douglass has been arguing for a long time, okay? So, number one, we get these new recruits and these formerly freed slaves. And number two, it's going to give the North, the Union, a new reason to fight. Things are not going well, especially in the Eastern Theater for the Union. Okay, they are continually losing against the South. Antietam technically was a draw, but they're going to take that as a victory. Okay, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. So, not only could he keep Britain and France out of the war, but if he frees the slaves will probably join and help fight for the Northern cause, help fight for the Union, and it will give the Union, the North, a new reason to fight and a new reason to go on. All right. So, besides being the right thing to do, getting rid of it, there are other strategic benefits for ending slavery. Now, that being said, Lincoln knows he needs a victory. Okay, the Union Army is losing. I've told you, in the Eastern Theater, things are not going well. Lee and the Confederates are continually defeating the Union generals. Okay, so before Lincoln does anything, he needs a victory to free the slaves, or else nobody's going to take him seriously. The North's not going to take him seriously. The South is definitely not going to take him seriously. Antietam is going to provide that victory. Even though it is a draw, Lee retreats into the South. Lee retreats back to Virginia. That is good enough and close enough for Lincoln to issue his initial Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. Now, the Battle of Antietam's in September 1862. Right after the battle, Lincoln issues the initial Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. Now, that will officially go into effect January 1st, 1863. Okay, so he's not really wasting any time. This is the closest thing we got to a victory. I will issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and it will go into effect January 1st, 1863. Okay, now what does this document say? All right. Where's the Emancipation Proclamation say? There's a nice little poster about it. It is a very important document, okay? It is kind of a watershed in American history. But let's talk about exactly what is said and what is not said, okay? Number one, it does free slaves. In the writing, it frees slaves, but it frees slaves in the rebelling states, namely the Southern Confederate states that have seceded. Okay, so it does say we're going to free some slaves, but they're going to be slaves in the rebelling states, those seceded Southern states. It says nothing about freeing slaves in the North or in the border states, okay? And really, that's the big area, the border states, because the border states are still loyal to the Union. They're still loyal to Lincoln. But Lincoln knows if he pushes the slave issue too hard, those border states are going to leave. And that means more states are going to join the Confederacy and all those troops. Because remember, the border states have soldiers fighting for both the North and the South. All of those troops are going to go to the South, and Lincoln doesn't want it. So when you look at the Emancipation Proclamation, you need to realize he frees the slaves in the seceded Southern states, not the slaves in the North, not the slaves in the border states. Okay? So in essence, when you get right down to it, the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't really free anybody, not even the Southern slaves, even though it says that in the document, because the Confederate states aren't going to listen to him. They're not under Union control. They've seceded. And the slaves he has the power to free, he doesn't, because he's worried that those border states are going to leave and join the South. So the question becomes, why is this document so important? You just said, Mr. Halterman, that this is a watershed in American history, and it is important, and that's what we need to talk about, okay? So the Emancipation Proclamation really has no immediate effect, but its power is in its symbolism. Emancipation does give the war a higher moral purpose. It's not just about preserving the country anymore, it's about giving freedom to a group of people. The struggle has become a fight to free the slaves, and you can't underestimate that. Okay? It gives the war a higher moral purpose, and now we're fighting to free the slaves. And number two, even though, yes, it doesn't really free anybody immediately, Lincoln lets the country know, he lets the world know, I am committed to ending slavery. Okay, that evolution has come full circle, and he realizes, I can do this, I need to do this, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to free the slaves. So even though it has no immediate effect, it is very, very symbolic. That cannot be underestimated. It gives the war a new purpose. It gives the war a moral purpose. And Lincoln lets everybody know, I'm committed to freeing the slaves. I might not be able to do it now, okay, but in this writing, this is what we're working toward, okay? Now, the outcomes, the effects. All right. Number one, it makes the destruction of slavery a Northern war goal. Okay. It is very, very symbolic, give a higher moral purpose. Now the war is not just about preserving the Union, it's about ending slavery. Okay. Now it's not going to happen overnight, but Lincoln is committed to ending slavery. So it gives the war that higher moral purpose. And number two, it does discourage interference from foreign governments. Britain and France are now committed to not joining the Confederacy. Okay. So that strategic value is going to happen. And since the war is now becoming about ending slavery, the other things that Lincoln was going to hope to happen do. Okay. The North has a new reason to fight. It's not just about preserving the country anymore, it's about ending slavery. And those freed slaves that make it to the North, or those freed slaves in the North, are now going to begin to join the Union Army and fight to help free others like them. Okay? So even though nobody is immediately freed, the symbolic value of the Emancipation Proclamation and these effects are very, very great and very, very positive. And that's why it's a watershed document. Okay? Now, let's go back to the beginning to those three questions, and I apologize for having to go real quick like this, but we'll go back through the pictures and everything. Oh, this picture of Lincoln right here was taken at the Antietam battlefield. Okay, Lincoln's here in the center. That's one of his generals right over there. And this is Alan Pinkerton, who is part of his bodyguard. Okay, and later goes on to found the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Okay, so it's either Pinkerton or Ward Hill Lamon, who was also one of Lincoln's bodyguards. Okay, so you got Lincoln here in the center, a Union general over here, and then one of his bodyguards right there. Okay, sorry, I diverge. I don't know if I told you or not, but the Civil War is one of my favorite topics to teach. So I've got all this great information, all these great stories. So oftentimes I go off on tangents. I apologize. All right, so let's go back to those first three questions, and we'll answer them here. Okay. Number one, what did the Emancipation Proclamation do? Okay. It freed the slaves in the Confederate States. Okay. That's what it actually says in the document. Now, we just talked about, in all honesty, in all reality, it doesn't free anybody. The Confederate States are not going to listen to Lincoln, and the slaves he does have the power to free, namely those in the North and those in the border states, he doesn't. Okay. But in the wording, it's supposed to free the slaves in the Confederate States. What does Lincoln hope the Emancipation Proclamation would encourage people to do? It would encourage freed slaves, other African Americans, to join the Union Army, and it would encourage the Union Army to continue fighting. It would give the North another reason to fight, not just preserving the Union. Now we got this high moral cause to end slavery. And then how was it a political move? It does help prevent Britain and France from supporting the South in the war. Now, truth be told, Britain was beginning to get cotton. That was the major export that it needed from the South. It was beginning to get cotton from other places like Africa. So the reality of Britain coming in, some historians debate whether or not that would have really happened or not. But definitely now that Lincoln makes the war about ending slavery, it's going to seal the coffin on any hopes of Britain coming in to support the Confederacy. Britain is just not going to support a nation that is not geared toward abolition and emancipation, because it's a big deal in Britain. Okay, so that's the Emancipation Proclamation. It is still a very, very important document. Okay, in the wording, it frees the slaves in the Confederate States, even though it really doesn't, because the South is not going to listen. And the North, it makes no mention of slaves in the North of the border states. But Lincoln's views of slavery have come full circle. He is now committed to ending slavery and preserving the country. He's hoping to encourage freed slaves and other Northerners to continue to fight, which it does. And it also helps prevent Britain and France from coming in on the side of the Confederacy. So a very, very important document, and it's going to lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about later, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.